Welcome to the Bare Metal Cyber C-Risk Prepcast. This series helps you prepare for the exam with focused explanations and practical contexts. Control implementation is the moment when a risk mitigation strategy becomes real. In other words, the shift from design to deployment is where risk is actually reduced or not. It's one thing to define a control on paper, it's another to integrate that control into live systems, processes, and user behavior. In other words, theoretical plans must be tested in the real world. A great design means little if implementation is rushed, fragmented, or misunderstood. In other words, weak execution can ruin strong intent. That's why the alignment of process, people, and platform is so important during rollout. In other words, controls only work when systems and people support them. If any one of those three elements fails to align, the control will either not work, or worse, give the illusion of working while silently failing. In other words, a false sense of security can emerge. C-Risk emphasizes that control existence is not the same as control effectiveness. In other words, being installed does not mean being useful. In C-Risk exam questions, scenarios often highlight a step that was skipped during implementation. In other words, oversight is often where rollout failed. Not just whether a control was present can lead you to the correct answer. Pre-implementation planning ensures the control has a foundation for success. In other words, deployment starts before launch day. Start by confirming the scope of the control, its objectives, dependencies, and any change control requirements. In other words, know exactly what the control must do and what it relies on. Assign roles for implementation, testing, ownership, and approval. In other words, every participant must know their responsibility. High-impact controls should always have contingency or rollback plans, especially when changes affect users, systems, or regulatory obligations. In other words, a backup plan protects continuity. Equally important is clear communication. Users must know what is changing, when, and why. In other words, change without communication leads to confusion. If they don't, resistance or confusion may result, even if the control itself is technically perfect. In other words, failure may stem from surprise, not defect. In C-Risk scenarios, clues like users were unaware of the change point to rollout planning failures, not design mistakes. In other words, planning breakdowns often cause implementation failure. Control effectiveness begins with communication, accountability, and preparedness. In other words, strong planning is the foundation of successful execution. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other podcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. The control must be integrated with the business process it's meant to protect. In other words, controls must match how people work. That means understanding the process steps, system interactions, and user behaviors where the control will function. In other words, know where the control fits in the workflow. For example, an approval control for payments should align with the actual financial workflow, not add redundant or disconnected steps. In other words, practicality supports adoption. Involve process owners early in the design and validation phases. They can flag whether the control will be usable or likely bypassed. In other words, stakeholders help improve fit. When users bypass a control, the cause is often poor fit, not intentional non-compliance. In other words, design failure leads to workaround behavior. On the exam, if a scenario describes a control being ignored, think first about process alignment. In other words, usability often determines compliance. Well-integrated controls are invisible to users but essential to risk mitigation. In other words, the best controls work behind the scenes. That's why integration is not just about location in the system. It's about fit with daily work. In other words, function and flow must work together. Technical control implementation must follow structured, quality-driven steps. In other words, don't treat deployment like a checklist. First, validate the configuration of tools such as firewalls, logging agents, or access systems. In other words, check settings before activation. Ensure parameters meet both security requirements and operational constraints. In other words, enforce policy without breaking processes. Always test in a staging or sandbox environment before deploying to production. In other words, avoid risk through trial. This step helps prevent system outages or unintended access failures. In other words, testing protects stability. Automate where possible using scripts or tools that enforce policies consistently reduces human error. In other words, automation increases consistency. Document dependencies, such as whether a control requires functioning time sync or centralized logging. In other words, know what supports the control. On the exam, failure to test before deployment or skipping configuration validation often points to the root of the failure. In other words, rushed deployment leads to risk. Sound deployment practices are a pillar of control effectiveness. In other words, quality starts with execution discipline. Administrative and physical controls must be rolled out with attention to people, not just systems. In other words, human factors are central to control success. Administrative control deployment includes delivering training, updating documentation, and distributing updated policies. In other words, tell people what to do and why. Gather attestations when needed to confirm policy review or acknowledgement. In other words, record compliance as proof. Physical controls require on-site validation, checking badge readers, signage, locks, or access panels. In other words, verify that the physical layer works. Accountability must be assigned, not just for installation, but for long-term enforcement. In other words, every control needs an owner. Controls that no one enforces become symbolic and ineffective. In other words, ignored controls fail quietly. On the exam, good answers include multi-layer education, communication, and behavioral support. In other words, adoption is driven by awareness and reinforcement. Implementation is only complete when people know what to do and how to comply. In other words, knowledge enables compliance. Once a control is deployed, initial monitoring begins. In other words, verification must follow installation. Start by establishing a performance baseline before implementation and compare it after rollout. In other words, measure impact with data. Use logs, system reports, behavioral monitoring, or alerts to confirm that the control is functioning. In other words, visibility proves performance. Key control indicators should be created and reviewed regularly. In other words, continuous data guides oversight. These indicators help detect if a control has failed silently or is being bypassed. In other words, silent failure is still failure. Avoid waiting for audits, monitor in near real time where possible. In other words, don't wait to find out it didn't work. In exam scenarios, a control that exists but doesn't reduce risk usually indicates a monitoring failure. In other words, unmonitored controls create blind spots. Continuous visibility is part of control health, not just compliance. In other words, control success is ongoing, not one time. Change management is a critical part of control implementation. In other words, how changes are introduced affects their success. Follow frameworks such as ITIL or NIST guidance for changes to systems, data, or business workflows. In other words, use formal structure for change, engage stakeholders early to build buy-in and reduce last-minute resistance. In other words, communication prevents disruption. Document all approvals, change requests, fallback options, and exception handling. In other words, create traceable history. Steering committees or change boards should review high-impact implementations. These forums help ensure governance oversight and reduce the risk of isolated decision-making. In other words, group visibility supports accountability. On the exam, missing approvals or skipped steps often point to a gap in change management. In other words, structure is key. Control deployment without structure is an invitation to failure. In other words, rushed change equals high risk. Implementation rarely goes perfectly. Be ready for challenges. In other words, expect setbacks. Common problems include conflicting priorities, lack of resources, or limited budgets. In other words, money and time are frequent limits. Other challenges include technical integration problems with legacy platforms or incompatible cloud tools. In other words, old systems complicate new controls. User resistance is also common when training is inadequate or controls are poorly explained. In other words, lack of understanding leads to pushback. Sometimes controls are deployed but never tested or handed off to a control owner. In other words, follow-through is incomplete. In C-risk scenarios, select answers that reflect thoughtful problem solving, not cutting corners. In other words, prefer planning over improvisation. The best options usually involve coordination, documentation, and stakeholder communication. In other words, collaboration drives resolution. Post-implementation reviews confirm whether controls achieved their goal. In other words, success must be validated. A structured review should examine whether risk levels decreased and if the control performed as expected. In other words, performance must be measured. This may involve interviews, testing, or performance reports. In other words, use diverse methods to confirm. Document the outcome, including lessons learned or needed improvements. In other words, feedback feeds optimization. Hand off control ownership to the appropriate function, including responsibilities for monitoring, updating, and reporting. In other words, assign accountability. Update the risk register, control libraries, and GRC platforms with final configurations. In other words, make updates official. In C-risk questions, the correct answer will close the loop and show that implementation leads to ongoing control ownership. In other words, implementation is only complete with follow-up. C-risk exam questions about implementation often ask what step failed or what comes next. In other words, sequencing matters. If a control was rolled out but risk increased, look for what was skipped: testing, training, communication, or ownership. In other words, find the missing piece. If you are asked what to do after implementation, the correct answer usually involves monitoring, validation, or reassessment. In other words, deploy is not the end. For rollout questions, look for steps that involve stakeholder engagement, documented plans, and testing environments. In other words, structure supports success. If users bypass the control, it usually reflects poor design fit or lack of awareness. In other words, failure stems from friction or surprise. Choose answers that show planning, alignment, and continuous verification, not shortcuts. In other words, quality execution wins. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Bare Metal Cyber C-Risk Prepcast. For more episodes, tools, and study support, visit us at baremetalcyber.com.